Good morning. Today I'd like to cover the events of Good Friday on Holy Week. We're going to begin with Luke 22, 47 to 53. At this point, Jesus is in the garden with his disciples and Judas greets him with a kiss. Jesus asked, "Do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" This was so that the religious leaders and the temple guards could know who to arrest, and that was the arrangement that was made with Judas, with them. Simon Peter cut off the ear of Malchus, and he was a servant of the high priest. He was a fisherman, bear in mind, and not a soldier, and I personally believe that he took a slice at the neck and he missed and he hit the ear. Jesus healed Malchus and asked the mob, "Am I a dangerous criminal that you should come out after me with clubs and swords?" And he said, why didn't you come for me when I was in the temple, when I was there every day, and arrest me then? But then Jesus told them that this is your hour. This is the moment and the hour where darkness reigns. Mark 14:50. The disciples fled. I'd like to ask, how often do we flee when we're in a social situation or something at work where we're confronted with something that would involve our faith, and instead of confronting it, we choose to flee? Just something that we should all ask ourselves. Mark 14:53 through 65. Jesus was led to the high priest's home where the religious leaders had gathered, and Peter followed far behind, and he sat outside warming himself by the fire, keeping himself at the periphery as we sometimes do again with our faith. We kind of stay back and not involve ourselves too closely. False witnesses were brought in to speak against Jesus. The problem was they contradicted each other. Some testified that he would destroy this temple made with human hands, and he will build another within 3 days, which alludes to John 2:19, where Jesus did say, "You'll destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it in 3 days." His body is that temple, and they did destroy it in 3 days. They did destroy it, but in 3 days he did rebuild it. High priest did ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Jesus said, "I am." Now don't miss that. If you remember, in the burning bush, the pre-incarnate Christ had told Moses, when Moses asked, "Who is it that I should say sent me?" And God said, "I am that I am." So the high priest knew exactly what he was talking about. He said, "I am," and he said, "You will see me, the Son of Man, sitting at God's right hand in the place of power and coming back on the clouds of heaven." With that, the high priest had tore his clothes, which for a high priest was against Jewish law at that time for him to do so. And he said, "This is blasphemy. And do we need any more witnesses?" And at that point, they condemned him to death. Some spit on him, they blindfolded him, and they played what was called hot hand. Basically, the Roman soldiers, when they had a prisoner, they would blindfold him and strike him, and the prisoner had to try to guess who hit him. And of course, even if he was right, the prisoner was never right. Matthew 26:69 through 75. Servant girls had approached Peter when he was out in the courtyard, and they stated, "You were with Jesus, weren't you?" And of course, 3 times they asked him, and 3 times he cursed and took oaths and said, "I never knew the man," 3 times. And with that, the rooster crowed. And when that happened, Peter remembered what Jesus said, that before he crows 3 times, "You will deny me." And he went away and wept bitterly. Mark 15:1. Jesus was bound by the religious leaders, and he was taken to Pilate, the governor of Rome. In John 18:28 to 38, Jesus' trial before Caiaphas, when that ended, and he was taken to Pilate, his accusers didn't go because, oddly enough, they didn't want to be defiled, or else they would not be able to participate in the Passover feast. Pilate asked the charges that they brought him before him for, and they just said if he wasn't guilty of something, we wouldn't have brought him. And he tried to put him back on the Jewish leaders, and they said, we can't do anything with him because we're not allowed to execute. And that's why he was brought to Pilate, because only Rome could do the execution. Pilate asked Jesus if he is the king of the Jews, and he explains that he is. You say that I am, and your kingdom, and that his kingdom was not of this world. And then when Jesus said, this is the truth, Pilate said, what is truth? Which reminds me in our society today, when we say that truth is relative. I have my truth, you have yours, and what is truth? And we can see that there wasn't a whole lot of difference back in those days as our culture today in regards to that. John 18:39-40. The Jews and religious leaders asked for the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus when he was offered as per their custom. And in John 19:1-4, Jesus is flogged. That crown of thorns was placed on his head. A royal purple robe was given to him. And they mocked him, yelling, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And then they beat him again. Pilate came out with him and declared him not guilty. In John 19:5-15, the leading priests shout for Jesus' crucifixion. And at that point, Jesus refuses to answer any more questions from Pilate. Pilate is afraid because the Jews told him that if he does not execute him, then he is no friend of Caesar, which is really frightening for a Roman governor. With this, Pilate washes his hands of Jesus, thereby making his decision about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And he sentenced him to death to stop the riot which was forming. And that was his decision. And once he made that decision, as all mankind has to make a decision about Jesus Christ one way or the other, no one can get out of that. At that point, Barabbas was released. Simon of Cyrene was forced to follow Jesus when they were marching him to Golgotha, and he was forced to carry his cross. When Jesus was nailed to that cross and the cross put up, the women wept for him. And he tells the women not to weep for him, but to weep for themselves and for their children. And he was referencing the future, as he knew that in 70 AD the Romans would besiege the city and destroy the temple. Being led to Golgotha, the place of the skull, on Golgotha, the place of the skull, there was two criminals crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left, which to me foretells the judgment day, when all men are judged and the goats will be to the left and the sheep will be to the right. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jesus' clothes were gambled for by the soldiers, and the crowd was shouting, "He saves others, but he cannot save himself." There was a sign above the cross that read, "This is the King of the Jews." That sign was written in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. It was written in Greek, the language of intelligence and education. It was written in Latin, the language of law and order, and in Hebrew, the language of religion. And Jesus Christ will rule over all three of those one day. The first criminal scoffed at Jesus and said, "Save yourself and us." The second criminal defends Jesus as an innocent man, undeserving of this punishment. He states to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said, "I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise." To unpack that portion a little bit, I'd like to say that in that short window of time, the criminal's eyes were open, the second one, the thief on the cross. And I'd like to point out that That man had nothing else to his credit. He had no church membership. He had no good works to show for. He had no baptism, and he had no sinner's prayers or anything else that many places seem to require. But all he had was his faith and his belief, and that was enough. John 19:28-30, Jesus then said, "It is finished." All the sin had been paid for, all of it. You just have to accept the gift. Jesus freely gave up his spirit. He volunteered it. It was never taken from him. Mark 15:38-39, the temple curtain was torn top to bottom, from God to man, not the other way around. Only God himself could open that way for man to come to God. There is no longer a need at this point for a high priest other than Jesus Christ himself, who is our high priest. He is our bridge to God the Father. Matthew 27:57-61. Joseph of Arimathea gets Jesus' body, asking it of Pilate. And Joseph wrapped the body of Jesus and placed him in his tomb, and the stone was rolled across the entrance. Both Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, they watched. This was evidence, as well as others, that Jesus' body was not stolen. Guards were placed there by the Roman soldier, by the Roman guard. They were placed there to watch over the tomb, to ensure that the body wouldn't be stolen, and then the disciples would claim later on that he had risen from the dead when he hadn't. So that was evidence from the religious rulers in Rome that did not occur. Death in the tomb could not hold Jesus, and because of his death and his resurrection, it would not be able to hold any believers all down through time ever again. Thank you, and happy Holy Week.